One of the biggest questions in Boruto is how to get around Daemon's ridiculous reflection ability and what his weaknesses are. Because like Itachi said, every jutsu has a weakness. Obviously, we already know Daemon needs to be touching somebody to reflect an attack, but there's definitely more to it as we've seen over the last several chapters, which is why I'm covering this topic again. And I think I might have figured out another weakness to the ability, and in the process also figured out how the ability actually works in the first place. I'll give you the important observations, then break it down, and give a ton of examples so that no matter what, everyone will understand it. So stick with me until the end. So first, let's take a look at what Amato says in chapter 75 about Daemon's abilities. He said he reflects all attacks, any action that would inflict harm upon him, and though it's necessary for his hand to be touching another person, his ability will also transfer to the person currently touching him. And he also said, just be careful not to aim murderous intent toward him, no matter what, because that too will be reflected. It depends on certain conditions, but it will all rebound back to you. So there's two main things I want to draw your attention to. The first is that Amato said hand singular, not hands plural like Bug said in chapter 71. This gives the impression that Daemon only needs to touch somebody with one hand to reflect attacks, not both at the same time. And we see Daemon do this several times, like in chapter 75 for example. Daemon's right hand wasn't touching anybody, but his left hand off panel looks like it must have been touching Ada somewhere, because Kawaki's attack got reflected. And speaking of that, I went back and looked at the various times Daemon reflects attacks, and as far as I can tell and find, Daemon was always either touching someone with both hands or only with his left hand, never with just his right hand, unless I'm missing one. So just like how Ada likes to hide her left hand all the time, this might mean that Daemon's left hand is key to his reflection ability. At the very least, there seems to be something going on with both of their left hands, unless it's really just a coincidence that Ikimoto has been drawing things this way. On the flip side, Amato saying hand might mean Daemon only needs to use one hand for the ability, and Bug saying hands might mean that it doesn't matter which hand Daemon uses. Either hand can work. Not really all that important, but I figured I'd mention it anyway. The real thing I want to point out, that pertains to the rest of the video, is that some of what Amato says doesn't line up with what we actually see in the story. He's being a sussy load of turd and not telling the full story like usual. Amato said that Daemon reflects all attacks, any action that would inflict harm. However, this simply isn't true. Even while touching someone with both of his hands, Daemon has both reflected an attack that doesn't inflict any harm, and has not reflected attacks that would inflict harm. It was shown in chapter 69 by Shikamaru that you can attack Ada if the jutsu doesn't inflict harm, which I predicted was a weakness after chapter 67 when I started my channel, because Code was also able to use an attack on Ada that doesn't inflict any harm, that being his claw marks. And that's also why I said Goro was probably able to defeat Ada by using his virus, which paralyzes you, but doesn't really hurt or kill you. Code placed a claw mark on Ada's chest in chapter 57 when she walked out of her pod. Then he tried to kill her with his claw finger, but he couldn't because he was captivated by her. Even if you want to say Code was only able to place that claw mark on her because he wasn't captivated by her quite yet, until she looked at him and said, "Go ahead and try." It doesn't matter.
It doesn't matter!
Because Code actually removes that claw mark when she goes to brush her teeth, as it's gone when she looks in the mirror, and when she comes back it's still gone, and it's stayed gone ever since that scene when she walked out of the pod. But then in chapter 62, Code placed another claw mark on Ada, this time on her right arm instead of her chest, which is a spot he had never placed a claw mark on Ada previously, and he was most certainly captivated by her at this point, as they literally talked about Code's feelings for Ada, and he couldn't kill her when he tried to by this point already. But despite that, he could still place a claw mark on Ada again because the attack doesn't inflict any harm on her. The reason I bring this up is because in chapter 60, Code tried to use his claw marks on Daemon, but they were reflected back onto himself instead. Amato said Daemon reflects any action that would inflict harm on him, but Code used an ability that doesn't inflict any harm, as evident by him being used it on Ada more than once, and also the fact that they don't do anything other than place a mark for space-time transportation. But that ability was still reflected onto Code. And Code didn't even have overly malicious, violent intent or killing intent towards Daemon when he did this. He was simply trying to learn more about Daemon's reflection ability, but it still got reflected. So that right there means that Amato is leaving out some details about Daemon's reflection ability, as it also reflects attacks that don't inflict harm on Daemon, not just those that do inflict harm. And as a quick side note, I've said this probably a million times by now, but I'll say it again. The whole killing intent thing is a lot simpler than some of you guys think it is. What Amato said,
Just be careful not to aim murderous intent toward him, no matter what, because that too will be reflected. It depends on certain conditions, but it will all rebound back to you.
all he's saying is don't think about killing Daemon, because if Daemon is touching someone, whatever you imagine doing to him will get reflected onto you instead. Where a killing attack is gonna be a lot more lethal to yourself than a slap in the face will be. That's all it is. Going back to what Amato said though, he said Daemon reflects all attacks. Any action that would inflict harm on him, as long as he's touching someone with his hand. This also isn't true. There are 3 examples where Daemon was touching someone and something didn't get reflected. And then I want to tie a 4th scene into this afterwards. The first example is in chapter 67. From chapter 61 to chapter 67, Daemon is asleep hugging Ada. But then Code pulls Daemon through his claw mark so he can reflect Kawaki's attack. If one of Daemon's hands were touching Ada, Code shouldn't have been able to grab Daemon and pull him through the claw mark. If anything, it should have reflected this move, and Code should have went into the claw mark and popped down in Boro's hideout with Ada and Daemon. I won't put too much stock into this scene because in earlier chapters, Daemon's hands were just hanging down while he slept, so it's possible that neither of his hands were actually touching Ada, but they easily might be resting right on Ada's thighs, which would meet the requirements for reflection based on what we've been told. But we don't know for sure since we didn't see where his hands were in chapter 67, and it was never made clear whether his hands were touching Ada's legs or not. In the next 2 scenes though, this is not the case. The next one comes in chapter 74 when Daemon is fighting Boruto. Boruto goes in for a punch and Daemon catches it. Then Boruto goes for a sideways kick where Daemon is holding both of Boruto's fists, but instead of the attack getting reflected, Daemon jumps to dodge the kick, and then he knocks Boruto out after that. Daemon was touching Boruto's fists with both of his hands, so Boruto's kick should have been reflected onto himself, but that wasn't the case. I know there's the theory that Daemon might be able to turn his ability on and off, but honestly, that doesn't seem to be implied anywhere in the story, and it also just kinda goes against what Daemon says and does in chapter 74. After Kawaki's attack with his ninja tech arm blade got reflected, Daemon got off of Boruto's back so that he wasn't touching Boruto anymore and said, "Sorry, no more cheap tricks, I promise. Try me again." What's being implied is that Daemon let go of Boruto so he wouldn't reflect Kawaki's attack anymore. Not that he just turned his ability off, as we were already told by Bug that Daemon has to touch people with his hands to reflect attacks. In addition, it would seem oddly convenient that Daemon just turned off his ability in all 3 of the scenes I'm talking about today, especially when they have something major in common. So let's talk about the 3rd example. This one comes in chapter 77. Daemon lunged at Himawari to ask who she is, and he put both of his hands on her shoulders, and he keeps them there over the next several panels. But then Boruto yanks Daemon off of Himawari, even though he was touching her with both of his hands. Yet Boruto yanking Daemon wasn't reflected onto Boruto. Boruto should have been thrown backwards, as if somebody yanked him backwards instead, but that wasn't the case. I realize being yanked backwards isn't some super deadly attack, but like I said, Daemon reflects attacks that don't inflict harm too, just like Code's claw marks. And it definitely harms Daemon more than Code's claw marks do, which don't do anything on their own other than appear there. So there's no reason for Boruto yanking Daemon not to get reflected. And the same goes for Code yanking Daemon through his claw mark, and the same goes for Boruto trying to kick Daemon, which is indisputably an attack that would inflict harm on Daemon if it landed. In 2 of these scenes, it is very clear that Daemon is touching someone with both of his hands, yet none of these actions got reflected. So why is that?
Seriously? You asked why?
Have you noticed what all 3 of these examples have in common? They're all basic taijutsu actions. Code just grabbed Daemon in chapter 67. Boruto just grabbed Daemon in Chapter 77, and Boruto went for a kick in Chapter 74. As weird as it may seem, we've actually never seen Daemon reflect a basic punch or kick or grab. Daemon has reflected attacks from Kawaki's body morph ninja tech arm thing and Code's big claw hands, but Kawaki's ninja tech arm thing is a ninja tech ability, and Code's claw hands are also either ninja tech or a shinjutsu, since they're related to his claw marks. So neither of the two are basic taijutsu actions. When I say a basic punch or kick or basic taijutsu, I mean a basic punch or kick with no special ninja attack or ninjutsu abilities tied onto it. Daemon has never reflected an action like that. Now, we didn't see what Kawaki imagined exactly when Daemon reflected Kawaki's intent of beating Daemon up in Chapter 75, but Kawaki most likely imagined smacking Daemon with his ninja tech arm because that's the main thing Kawaki likes to do. The dude morphs his arm in literally every fight he's in. Now, I mentioned a fourth scene earlier, and this time we're going all the way back to Daemon's introduction when he fought Boru's guards at the hideout. It's always been a theory that Daemon might not be able to reflect pure taijutsu attacks, and that's because of this scene. There were 4 guards who came to attack Daemon. The first one had a chakra blaster, the second had an axe, the third didn't have a weapon, and the fourth had a sword. Daemon first reflected the attack from the chakra blaster dude, then he reflected the attack from the axe guy, but then for the third guard who didn't have a weapon, Daemon actually jumped off Code's back to kick him in the head instead of reflecting anything, and then he touched the dude he knocked out off panel so he could reflect the sword guy's attack. Seems kinda fishy to me. It would be one thing if he also kicked the sword guy in the head to knock him out too, but then maybe you could have said he was just bored of reflecting, so he jumped off of Code so he could beat them up with taijutsu. But the fact that he reflected his attack means he literally bent down and touched the knocked out guy to reflect the next attack, which means he intentionally chose to reflect the first, second, and fourth guard's attacks, who all had weapons, but chose to directly attack the one guard who didn't have a weapon. I don't think that's a coincidence. You could argue maybe the guy didn't have any attacks in mind yet, so there was nothing for Daemon to reflect. But given the other 3 scenes I mentioned, I don't think that's what they were going for. It seems like Daemon knows about this weakness, and that's why he immediately jumped off Code's back to kick the guy himself, but not for any of the other guards with weapons. Daemon also never gets surprised that he didn't reflect the actions I mentioned earlier in those 3 other scenes. When Code pulled him through the claw mark, he didn't question how Code was able to do that. All he wanted to know was who he was fighting so he could beat the enemy up. When Boruto went for a kick in Chapter 74, Daemon wasn't startled at all about not being able to reflect the attack, and instead just jumped up and dodged Boruto's kick with ease. And when Boruto yanked Daemon off of Himawari in Chapter 77, again, Daemon wasn't surprised that Boruto was able to do that. It seems like Daemon just can't reflect pure taijutsu actions, and he's well aware of that. So that's the observation side of things. But the question you should be asking is, why can't Daemon reflect pure taijutsu attacks?
Well.
To answer that, we need to consider how the ability actually works. Amato never explained how Daemon actually reflects attacks, and how the ability works at its core, so I'm gonna propose how I think the ability might work, as it will explain why Daemon can't reflect pure taijutsu attacks, and it's very similar to the Sharingan in concept. For a quick review of the Sharingan has many abilities, but its powers of insight are what's relevant here. The Sharingan lets the user read the opponent's movement patterns to successfully predict their movements, attacks, and hand signs, and similarly, it has the ability to discern the opponent's genjutsu, taijutsu, and ninjutsu, and it can memorize the hand signs and chakra attributes of the opponent's jutsu whilst discerning it, and then copy that jutsu and make it their own, which is what Kakashi was famous for doing. So essentially, the Sharingan lets the user read their opponent's movements and chakra and copy them to use as their own ability, as long as it's not a Kekkei Genkai or beyond their chakra reserves. I think Daemon's dojutsu, which seems to be what gives him that reflection ability, works very similarly to the Sharingan. But instead of reading the opponent's muscle twitches and movement patterns to predict their movements and attacks, I think Daemon's dojutsu reads the flow of energy leaving the opponent's body to be directed towards Daemon, either in real time or inside the opponent's imagination. And instead of copying the attack like the Sharingan, it reflects it onto the opponent instead. And while Daemon doesn't seem to have 360-degree vision like the Byakugan does, the Dojutsu's ability to read that flow of energy seems to have a 360-degree range of effect, because he reflects things whether he's looking at the attack or not. And the Dojutsu can't remember an attack, it reflects it like how a Sharingan user can remember a move they've copied and reuse it. Daemon's Dojutsu doesn't have that benefit. The key points, though, are the energy used for the attack leaving the opponent's body, and the attack being directed towards Daemon. If you look closely at the chapters when Daemon reflects things, you'll notice that the attacks all get reflected the moment that both the opponent's energy gets transferred to their attack, and the attack is directed towards Daemon. Thus, there are 3 conditions that must be met in order for Daemon to reflect an attack. Those being that Daemon needs to touch someone, the attack needs to be directed towards Daemon or whoever he's touching, and the energy used for the given attack needs to leave the opponent's body before it hits Daemon. The flow of energy thing might sound confusing at first, but don't worry, I'm going to give you a ton of examples to explain what that means and why taijutsu doesn't get reflected as a result. We'll start with the examples that do get reflected, and the easiest example is Kawaki's Chakra Blast in most ninjutsu attacks. When Kawaki shoots his Chakra Blast, a blast of energy literally fires out of Kawaki's hand and leaves his body. And that attack got reflected by Daemon just as the blast was leaving Kawaki's hand. If Konohamaru shot a fire style jutsu at Daemon, the energy would fire out of Konohamaru's mouth in the form of fire, thus leaving his body. Konohamaru's attack would reflect the moment the fire left Konohamaru's mouth towards Daemon, or when he thought about shooting a fireball at Daemon, whichever comes first. Those are some ninjutsu examples. In the case of somebody controlling a weapon, like the axe guy for example, when he swings his arm to attack, the energy from his arm swinging is transferred to the axe, meaning it's left his body and gone to the axe instead. That's just physics. And once it's directed towards Daemon, it gets reflected on the axe guy. You literally see this in the panels. When he swings his arm back, it doesn't get reflected yet, but the moment he starts to swing it forward towards Daemon, that's when it gets reflected. When Kawaki makes his ninja tech arm thing, he manifests this weird black matter outside of his arm to create a weapon, meaning that energy left his body to create this black substance. So once it's directed at Daemon, it gets reflected onto Kawaki. When Code creates his claw marks, he's manifesting physically embodied chakra mixed with iron from his blood to create those claw marks outside of his body. So again, that energy leaves his body and is directed towards Daemon and it gets reflected instead. This next one is the trickiest. When Code grows his hands into giant claws, or when Cho-Cho uses the partial expansion jutsu for example, they are transferring their energy into matter to grow their hands. So while it looks like it's contained within their body still, the concept is pretty much the same as Kawaki's ninja tech arm. They're manifesting more size to their body, meaning the energy leaves the bounds of their normal body to create this new matter in the form of a larger hand. It's energy converted into matter. Again, it's just physics and science here. I know it sounds weird, but the point is they're using a jutsu to change their body. It's like making a Rasengan, but it just looks different. As with the others, when the energy leaves the user's body and is directed towards Daemon, the attack gets reflected instead. You get the point by now. So now we come back to regular old taijutsu, like when Boruto tried to kick Daemon in chapter 74. What is so different about taijutsu? The flow of energy doesn't leave the opponent's body until it hits the target. That's what's different. When a boxer punches a punching bag, he or she transfers the energy from the movement of their fist and transfers it to the punching bag in the form of kinetic energy. And that's why the punching bag moves. Same thing happens when they punch somebody in the face. The energy from a punch or a kick or a push or whatever is transferred at the moment of impact, not before. Which means the 3 conditions I mentioned for Daemon's reflection ability to work can never be met with a regular punch or kick, as it will be too late by the time the energy leaves the opponent's body, as Daemon will have already been punched by then. That's why he always dodges instead. And when it comes to special taijutsu techniques, you still need to keep all of the same rules in mind that I mentioned earlier. So attacks like Asakujaku, Hirudora, and Sekizo, which just punch the air to attack the opponent, and so on, would probably still get reflected because the energy leaves the user's body before it hits Daemon. On the flip side, attacks like Tsunade's chakra-enhanced punches, the primary and hidden lotuses, Night Guy, Baryon Mode Naruto's punches, and so on, probably wouldn't get reflected because they work just like regular punches but contain a lot more power than normal coming from within. And I imagine all of this stuff applies if somebody imagines punching Daemon with a regular punch or other pure taijutsu move. It probably wouldn't get reflected, as it doesn't really seem to make any difference whether you imagine attacking Daemon or actually try to attack Daemon. All the same rules seem to apply. I think this all makes a lot of sense, but for anyone who thinks this is too complicated, the Boruto series literally used nuclear fusion to explain Baryon Mode's power, so I don't see why they can't use some basic physics to explain Daemon's weakness. I just broke it down step by step. At its core, it's just taking the Sharingan's abilities and adding an OP twist to it, and using physics to explain the weakness of it. It's not that bad. Now, something I really like about this explanation is that it's actually similar in concept to the original idea I brought up for Daemon's weakness almost a year ago when I first started making videos. I brought up how Ada and Daemon's Dojutsu both resemble moons, where moons are closely associated with time in the Naruto series. So since Ada's Senrigan can see the past and present but not the future, meaning the future is essentially the Senrigan's weakness, while Daemon's Dojutsu reflects attacks that would be about to hit Daemon in the future, perhaps Daemon's weakness lies in the past and present. The weakness I gave back then is similar in many ways to the one I'm giving now, but there are some key differences of course. As I explained earlier, Daemon's ability might sense the flow of energy leaving the opponent's body and transferring to whatever attack they are doing, which then gets directed towards Daemon. Using Kawaki's Chakra Blast as an example again, when the blast just leaves Kawaki's hand, the actual attack hasn't hit Daemon yet, but it gets reflected in that moment. In essence, the ability reflects what would have been a future moment. However, in the case of taijutsu, as I explained earlier, the flow of energy doesn't leave the opponent's body until the taijutsu attack actually hits Daemon, at which point it's no longer a future moment that the attack would hit Daemon. Instead, it's happening in the present and will soon be in the past. Daemon can't reflect an attack that's already hitting him in the present or already hit him in the past. It's too late at that point. It's actually what I said way back then. I said maybe Daemon can't reflect an attack you used on him in the past. So I thought, maybe if you used an attack on Daemon and survived your own attack when it reflected, maybe he couldn't reflect that same attack again. That wasn't correct, obviously, but funnily enough, some of those same words can still be used now. Daemon still can't reflect an attack that you used on him in the past, not because you can safely use it on him now the second time around, but because that attack literally happened in the past, so now it's too late. What's done is done. Funny how simple that is. So overall, there seems to be three main weaknesses to Daemon's reflecting ability. First is that he needs to be touching someone with at least one hand, possibly his left hand specifically. Second is that if you can tank your own attacks just fine because you have regeneration like Boro or really good armor or durability like Deepa, then it's really not that big of a deal if Daemon reflects an attack on you. You'll survive it anyway. Which I've said is a weakness for Daemon's ability since the beginning. And third is that Daemon doesn't seem to be able to reflect pure taijutsu attacks. I've given you the observations in the story to show you that it seems to be the case. I've broken down how the ability might work to explain why that could be the case, and offered another way to look at it with the time aspects. I guess a goofy fourth weakness would be if somebody else had a reflection type of ability, like Hidan's Curse Jutsu, as I'm not really sure what would happen if Hidan licked Daemon's blood and drew his Jashin symbol and then stabbed himself. The attack wouldn't be directed towards Daemon directly, as it's really just Hidan stabbing himself, so it might not even reflect it, but it is directed towards Daemon indirectly, since Daemon would suffer whatever damage Hidan does, so maybe it would reflect. But then if it does reflect onto Hidan, will that damage reflect onto Daemon, or will it keep reflecting onto Hidan in an endless cycle?
I don't know. I don't know why. There are many things I don't know.
And lastly, for a fifth potential weakness with no evidence for it, honestly, it just feels natural, that's all. It does seem kind of ridiculous for Daemon to be able to reflect continuous attacks over and over again without any limit. Like if 1,000 attacks were fired at Daemon, one after the other in rapid succession, could he really reflect all 1,000 attacks? Maybe, but there should probably be some chakra drain from Daemon using this ability, so the ability might stop if Daemon's chakra got too low. I brought that up in the past with Boru's virus, since technically there's tons of virus particles floating around. So would Daemon have to reflect each individual virus particle, or would it just reflect the attack as a whole? And even if it did, he could just send the virus out again, so at some point it's like, can he keep reflecting that? Either way, Boru has antibodies, so it doesn't matter, but I digress. Those last two are just maybes. The first three weaknesses are the big ones. I don't think I can explain any more about Daemon's ability, so I want to hear what you guys think. First, do you think Daemon can reflect pure taijutsu, or do you think he's unable to do so like I do? And second, do you like my idea for how Daemon's ability might work? Or do you disagree and think it works some other way? And do you like the time parallels between Ada and Daemon's respective dojutsu, where Ada's power lies in the past and present, but not the future, while Daemon's power lies in the future, but not the past or present? And out of curiosity, what do you think would happen with the Hedon situation? Would it be an endless cycle of reflecting? Would it work on Daemon? Or would Hedon eventually just die from all the reflection that's happening to him? Let me know how you think it would go down. And also, do you think there's a limit to how much Daemon can reflect? Like, will his chakra just drain and eventually gets too low and he can't reflect anymore? Or what do you think happens? Like, hypothetically, if someone just kept attacking over and over and over again and regenerating from their reflections, like, will there be a limit? What do you think there? And lastly, how sus do you think it is that Amato didn't reveal this to the Elite Village when Amato, of all people, should know about this weakness? And why do you think he omitted this information? Let me know in the comment section below, but that's a wrap on today's video, so thank you guys for watching until the end. I'm gonna reflect my own attacks back on you, so now you have to subscribe, leave a comment, like the video, become a member, and hit the bell icon for notifications. Have a great rest of your day, and I'll catch you guys next time. Bye!